Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank you. I know the idea of the Data Act at 9 o'clock in the morning after all those parties last night is probably very daunting for a lot of people. So I want to ask you, what are some of your favorite things that you'll take away from this session? And that can include the great handouts at the Innovation Center. What are you taking home with you from the sessions that you've gone to or from the booths that you've visited? Connections? Anybody get in the cash booth down at BBCon where you grab the money? Yes. Okay. Anyone else? For me, I'm sorry? Ideas? Yeah. For me, one of the memories that I'm going to take away is the blanket making. I thought that was such a cool thing, and so many pictures of people helping put those blankets together. So there's a lot of cool memories that'll happen as a result of this, and I hope it's not just all the cool swag that happened in the Innovation Center. I'm glad you're making connections and things like that. I always, when I teach and train on grant management, I like to do a little giveaway myself for the person who travels the farthest to hear me talk about grant management. And I have an inkling who might win this, but I'm not going to give any secrets away. So did anyone come more than 2,000 miles to attend? More than 2,000? More than 1,000? Okay. Okay, more than 8 hours? No. Okay, so I think we have a winner. I always like to give a copy of my book to the person who traveled the farthest because they have the most time on the plane to read it when they go home. So no watching on Netflix or something on the plane. You'll be all set. Thank you. Well, as you might have gathered, we're here to talk about the Data Act and specifically how it applies to federal grant recipients. So let me tell you a little bit about myself if you haven't been at one of my sessions before. My name is Lucy Morgan. I am a CPA. Sometimes I say I'm a recovering CPA, but that's one little CPA humor there. I've been partnering with Blackbaud for 2 years, and my hometown is Duluth, Minnesota. So a couple people who were in my session yesterday, I was telling the story of how I moved from Minnesota to Florida and actually did that in our sailboat. So we sailed down the Great Lakes, and 29 years ago, if you've been over to Inner Harbor, you used to be able to anchor right in Inner Harbor, and I remember going to sleep at night looking out the little window in the berth in the sailboat, looking up at that high rise right in the middle of Inner Harbor. And they used to have little paddle boats that went all around Inner Harbor, so you'd get up in the morning and there'd be all these little paddle boats waiting for you to come out of the cockpit in the boat. It was pretty funny. But I am from Duluth, Minnesota. I've tried really hard to lose my accent, but every time in fact, I was the first day I was here, I went down to Bubba Gump's to get some gumbo, and he said, "Are you from Canada or Minnesota?" I thought, dang, I still have that accent. I've been working with federal grant recipients I'm now into my second decade. I started by making the shift that probably a few of you have made, where you go from the for-profit world into the nonprofit world. And I was working on a 5-year construction project with the National Science Foundation for about $100 million. And we ran into a little, what I'll call a speed bump as we got to the end of that spending. And one of the things that happened as a result of that is I came to realize that there was not a lot of good training that was happening with grant recipients on how to manage their grants correctly. So to me, that sounded like a great opportunity. Because one of the things that really stuck with me is I believe that people really want to do the right thing when it comes to managing federal grants. Just oftentimes they don't really know what that is. And when I first started doing live training and even online training, most of the time it was just a bunch of finance people that would come. And what's happened since the uniform guidance came about, and has really been, to me, very evolutionary, is I'm starting to have more program folks in my programs than I am finance people. Which tells me either the finance people got tired of hearing me talk, or the program people are actually getting engaged on what it takes to run a successful program. And I think that's great as a taxpayer. It's also great to me just as an individual because I think that we get into grants not because we love compliance, but because we want to help people and we want to improve people's lives. And the cool thing about federal grants is there's a lot of money there to do that with. Now, the federal government brings a lot of things to the world, but they don't bring the vision on how to solve the problems in your community. And in fact, most of the times when the federal government mandates what those solutions are, they don't have really great outcomes. So you as a grant recipient or a grant writer or someone who's interested in federal grants, you really bring that vision on how to solve the problems in your own communities. And I think that's important. What the federal government brings to the table is they bring the ability to print money. And that's an important thing, right? I mean, they can solve big problems, but they might not. There's an old proverb that says, without vision, the people perish. And that's what you guys bring to the table. The federal government brings the money, you guys bring the vision on how to solve the problems. So like many of you, I mean, I wasn't born a compliance warrior. As a little kid, I didn't say, I want to grow up and manage grants. I also didn't say, I want to grow up and be a CPA. I mean, there was not an equivalent of Perry Mason that was a CPA, you know, on television, for those of you who remember Perry Mason. And I also like to say I work hard for the money. And I know if any of you are grant writers, you're doing the same thing. You're working hard for the money. If you've heard any of the other talks that I did yesterday, one of the things I talk about is how do we motivate people? How do we motivate people to go through transformational change when you're taking a lot of the labor out of the whole back office function, things like that. When you're managing grants, you want to do things as efficiently as possible. How do you motivate people? Well, you have to understand what motivates people, and it's different for all of us. This picture, any of you remember your first job? I really remember my first job because this is me. This was my first job. My grandpa had a hardware store. We all worked in the hardware store part of the time in the summer. And your very first job was dusting the toy aisle. And you got paid in toys. It was sweet. Not only did you get to figure out what toy you wanted by the time you got through dusting the toy aisle, sometimes you did a really good job, and you notice, I mean, I really had the swag here. I had tons of toys. That was one of my favorite days, because my grandpa understood what motivated me at that age. And I won't say he took advantage of it, but he understood how to motivate people. And it was a good lesson for me, too, to realize that people will work for things they believe in. People often will work really hard for things they believe in. So it's going to be, sometimes it's a little different, but one of the core things is we have to be able to communicate what our mission is and then get people to buy into that mission. So the federal government with the Data Act, they kind of have a mission. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what that is. The Data Act, to me, brings a huge opportunity for transparency. And you might be saying, well, why is that so important? I think that the Data Act could just totally transform how we think about what's going on with federal spending, not only in grants but also in contracts. It's the first US open data law. Now it sounds like almost kind of a geeky outcome. So the goal is to transform documents into a machine-readable format. So not something that's just you file a piece of paper, but you actually have some form of submitting data that can be read by machines. And it sets certain data standards for federal agencies and recipients and contractors. So there's a standard that you have to follow in that format to submit it. And it includes publication requirements, and to me that's the real power of the Data Act. The federal government now has a responsibility through legislation to provide more details on what money's being spent on. I think Mark Twain said, I mean, really the goal of it all, the public is the only critic whose opinion is worth anything at all. A lot of this started because there was a desire for the public to have more transparency about what dollars were being spent on. And it provides taxpayers, I mean, this is my favorite thing to do on a Saturday night, is to go see where the federal government's spending money. Watchdog groups, media, there's unprecedented access. We've never before been able to really tell what's going on with tax dollars. And you can view it in very easy to use formats. So it's not like I don't know, any of you remember microfiche? I can remember when I went to college and I had to do reports, I had to go to the library and get these things that look like film, which probably a lot of you don't even know what film is. Put it on a machine, you know, to get articles and things. It's totally made it so easy to figure out what's going on. And the Data Act, the piece that it brings to the table that's even more than it ever was before, is in the past with, any of you work on the stimulus grants, ARA grants, that was kind of the first of the reporting. With the Data Act, now we can trace all the way from the appropriation all the way to the spending. So you can see the entire circle as it goes around. And that's never in the history of the world has that been able to happen. So we're in the very early stages of this implementation on the federal side. There's been a site called usaspending.gov. This, again, is my favorite place to go on the weekend, see where the money is going. And usaspending.gov is out there. They have now opened a new beta site, which you can see the little tiny beta up there. The beta site is the one that's being driven by the Data Act. So this is like usaspending.gov on steroids. There's just starting to be information in that database, so it's not as filled out as you might like. But for example, I know this is kind of small, but it says in 2016, the US government spent $2.85 trillion with a T, dollars. How was that money used? We have the answers, and it's very easy to go in and figure out where the money went. Now, sometimes people want to do this just because they're kind of curious. So for example, they made 19 different budget categories, and there's 3 categories that make up over half of all federal spending. And again, this is not stuff you have to look hard for, it's right there. So again, this is going to be a little hard to read, but you can kind of see, okay, we had 3 categories, Social Security, National Defense, and Medicare made up half of all federal spending. Now, if you follow the news or if you're interested in grants, what do we hear a lot about? Oh my gosh, they're cutting educational spending, which is this little teeny block over here. We're really not having the difficult conversations, are we? We get focused on these little things that are very important to us, and sometimes we miss the bigger picture, which I think is one of the beauties of usaspending.gov, is it really gives you that bigger picture to say, here's really where the money, I mean, these are the big levers, and then here's the little levers. So when we get focused on the little things that are important to us, they are important to us. But there's a whole lot more money going into other areas. And maybe just some corrections on other areas could make a lot more money go into the things that we care about. Almost 80% of spending was awarded to individuals, private contractors, and then they lump in local governments in there, which I think is a little weird. Because first of all, you're saying, okay, individuals and private contractors, those are going to go out through contracts. Local governments aren't going out through contracts, that's going out probably through grants, so I think that was a little odd. But you can drill down, it's great. You can drill down, find who's spending the money, and it's really cool as a taxpayer. So for example, I have a group of ladies from Arizona that are out here probably as much as I am, and they contact me about every 3 months because they're convinced that somehow the trails that are being built in their communities, people are double dipping and getting paid multiple times to build these trails. And they go out on usaspending.gov and they can go, okay, who's getting money in my neighborhood, in my zip code? Who is it coming from? Who is it going to? What's their name? What's their DUNS number? They can get all that information. And for people who like to spend a lot of time searching on the internet, it's a wealth of data. So that may be one thing that you want to do with it, is find out, where's the money actually going in my state, in my community. If you're looking for funds, it's also a wealth of information. So for example, we were talking earlier about after-school programs for at-risk youth. Now, if you want to build an after-school program, are the skills that those kids need very similar if you're building up their self-esteem, or if you're talking to them about how to stay in school, or how to resist bullying? All those skills are very similar. But with usaspending.gov, you can see who's getting the funding. So I believe success leaves a trail. Let's go find out, okay, where's the money going? Oh, it's all going to anti-bullying programs. Oh, or it's going to self-esteem, or it's going to something else. You can find out the language of what is getting funded so that you can do those little tweaks as you write and look for money to find out what's being spent. So grants.gov, everybody know what grants.gov is? So grants.gov tells you what's coming up, what's available. usaspending.gov tells you what's been successful. This is where money has actually flown out the door to help different programs. So there's a lot of purposes, I think, that were not intended originally. I like to say it's been a long, strange trip, which is a quote by actually one of the, Jerry Garcia, who is the head of, I don't know if you'd call him the head, one of the main people in the Grateful Dead, used to say what a long, strange trip it's been. And the Data Act has followed the same type of odd path. So Colin Powell says, experts often possess more data than judgment. And I think that is the danger with any type of data collection is, are we going to actually make meaningful decisions about it, or do we just get overwhelmed by the vastness of the data? I've been using usaspending.gov for a number of years now, really since it came about after the stimulus grants. And to me, I think it's just very well designed, and it gives a lot of meaningful information. But I don't think it started that way. So let's kind of look at the path. How did it start? I call these the R&Rs. First of all, in 1966, they had to pass the Freedom of Information Act. That was what gave people the right to actually see what the federal government was spending money on. That wasn't necessarily a right before. It had to actually be passed as a law. Then in 1990, there was an act called the CFO Act, and that whole act was all about bringing kind of government into the 90s, again, the modern century in the 90s, of making sure that reporting by agencies was actually meaningful and followed kind of modern business practices. In that act was a requirement that agencies had to start reporting different aspects of what their agencies were spending money on. So again, prior to that, there was no requirement for agencies to tell anybody what they were doing. Then in 2006, this was really a monumental piece of legislation, which is the Federal Funding, Accountability, and Transparency Act, or FATA. And that, again, put in a requirement that what the federal government was spending money on had to be published and had to be available to the public for free. So if you ever go out looking for this type of data and the site wants you to pay for it, you probably aren't on the .gov site. It seems like as fast as the government puts out a website, there's all kinds of businesses that try to make their sites look like government sites and want to charge you money. So anytime you look at grants.gov, usaspending.gov, sam.gov, make sure you're always actually getting the one with the .gov extension. Or you might find someone wants to charge you for something that should be free. So these really laid the groundwork for the Data Act in transparency. So then we move up to 2011, and that's when the Data Act was introduced. And it actually, I know it seems hard to believe in today's climate, but had bipartisan support. So all, Congress, senators, everybody thought the whole idea of transparency was a really good thing. And to me, it was a really good thing because they wanted to do it through legislation as opposed to executive orders so that it was locked in place. But you'll notice President Obama didn't sign it until 2014. So what happened in that 3 years? Well, there was a lot of resistance actually from the Office of Management and Budget. They said, we've already got enough legislation, we don't need any more. Why do you want to put more stuff on? It's just going to be a lot of burden. And to me, that's always kind of funny to hear an agency actually pushing back, saying that it's more burden. But I think fortunately, it did eventually pass after 3 years. President Obama put it into law, signed it into law. And then the next year, they started setting the data standards. So what pieces of data are we going to collect? How are they relevant? In 2017, the first of the reporting started on the new Data Act with the agencies. And the pilot program was completed this spring. So like, most of us, when you're trying to learn how to run, you start by walking, jogging, running. The federal government followed that same path of saying, okay, first we're going to decide what it is we want to collect, and then we're going to run a pilot program, and then we're going to roll it out to the rest of the world. Next May should be the full publication of all the data elements that are available to the public. So I think next year you're going to start to see most of the benefits really start to come together. Here's the key date for you as a grant recipient. In August of 2018, so a little under a year, the federal government's going to make a decision on what they're going to start to require of grant recipients. So you might want to put a big star on your calendar for that day, or put the reminder in your phone that at this point they're going to start to talk about how is it going to directly impact us as grant recipients. So let's look at how they decide, kind of behind the scenes, how they defined what those relevant pieces of data were. And who better than a Roman philosopher to decide that? So a good decision is based on knowledge and not on numbers. We run the risk when we start getting tons of data collected of making decisions about stuff without actually questioning what it leads to. Last week I was just reading a story about an elderly couple that got stranded in the desert and in really tough shape because they followed the GPS on their car that took them off in Utah somewhere, who knows where they were, on a road that they never should have been on. And the same thing can happen with the Data Act, is if we just start blindly, without thinking about it, go, oh, the numbers say this, without questioning, I think we're going to run into difficulties. And I bet you, as they say in Minnesota, donuts to dollars, you've had the same type of experience when you start collecting data about your own programs, where if people don't apply a little knowledge and insight to it, it's really not that helpful. So the first challenge that the federal government ran into, and I think you will appreciate this, is what exactly is relevant? What are the elements that actually help us in decision making? So a lot of the concepts, we're talking about the Data Act, but a lot of these concepts also apply anytime you roll out software or you make transformation within an organization, is what really helps us make better decisions. Yeah, we collect all this stuff, but which ones of these are actually being used to make good decisions? The whole point was to drive accountability of federal spending because it's so easy to tell what's going on. But sometimes that can have unintended consequences. Now, yesterday I mentioned, how many of you got to see the ALS challenge guy on the opening day talk about they got 3 million people in 6 weeks? So one of the elements that's been collected since the days of the stimulus grants, when those started in 2009, is executive compensation. So you can go out, anybody who's getting federal money, you can go out and see what their key officers are making as long as it's over a certain threshold. Picture this for your organization. Let's say you're an organization that has really to the high end of those numbers. And just like you can get 3 million donors in 6 weeks, that gets out on social media and you could lose 3 million donors in 6 weeks. Now, so picture it's not always the good, it can also be the bad. So data is kind of like money. It can be used for good or it can be used for bad. It's just data. It's what we do with it that makes it relevant. The second challenge that they had is how to put it to new uses. One of the things that you'll find is that many of us are on this old model where auditors come in, people look at paper. I mean, that's been our paradigm of how fraud and waste, or someone calls the whistleblower hotline, those types of things. That's really changing. And the federal government is not at the forefront of this. Let's just think about what we do when we use a credit card. Now, I was back home visiting in my hometown, Duluth, Minnesota, which has a Shopko store, and I just love Shopko because they didn't have it in Colorado in the whole, most of the time I've lived out there. So I get excited, I get to go into Shopko and see what Shopko has. And I tried to charge something, and my card was declined, so I put it on a different card. I was walking out to the parking lot. I got a call from my bank saying, we noticed that someone tried to use your card to buy something at Shopko in Duluth, Minnesota. Was that you or not? And I had to say, yes, it was. You declined. I was trying to buy, these really cute pair of shoes, and I wish you had let me, but fortunately I had another card. Think about how fast that happens. Banks are not operating under auditors finding things. They've got big data. They've got analytics that are telling them something looks suspicious in this transaction. That's one of the goals of the federal government. That's one of the new uses of data, is they want to start looking for those types of waste and fraud transactions happening through the use of analytics. That should make, I think, a lot more programs be accountable for what they're spending, because it's not going to take 5 years to find this stuff. A lot of it's going to be found a lot quicker. So they're developing these big data analytics and detection tools. They also want federal agencies and their managers to make more data-driven decisions. we're in the social good sector, so what we look at is a lot of relationship building. And that same thing happens working on programs. With program officers, you're building relationships. The federal government likes that, but at the same time, they want more decisions that are driven on analytics, where people are actually making decisions based on the tools that those managers will get, not just, oh, let's give them a pass because they're good folks, that type of thing. So that's some of the new uses that are planned for the Data Act. And I think the really powerful one is going to be the analytics on waste and fraud. The number 3 challenge that I bet most of us can relate to is how do we get all this stuff to work? So in the past, we've had a lot of manual processes. The federal government's the same way. We remember we used to actually have to file paper reports, and then we started filing them on PDFs, and then we have to actually upload data. So that whole process has been changed. But it's still a very time-consuming manual process. Even the things like grants.gov to submit applications for grants are starting to evolve. We're not going to anymore be doing them on those PDF forms, right? They have the new workspace to submit grants on. So they're looking, how can we expand the software solutions both for the collection of the data and the transmission? So they're facing many of the same things that you face when you implement software. How do we ensure that the quality is there and the reliability is there? Yesterday at lunch, I was talking to some folks who were putting through some of the software, and I said, what concerns you? And they said, well, we didn't get a chance to clean up all the data. So we feel like we've got garbage in, garbage out. The federal government's going through that same thing. And they have probably more systems that they're trying to unite than you do. So one of the things that they've had a real challenge with is, okay, agencies are running on different systems, even within agencies. How do we get all that data, first of all, on a common platform that can be read across all systems, and then how do we get it in kind of a central place? And so we'll talk about what that strategy was. I mean, it's really, you think about a bureaucracy as big as the federal government trying to unite all these systems. I feel like Star Trek and Star Wars. Star Trek, remember, for those of you who are Trekkies, about the Borg collective, and we got to all get on the same mind and we're all thinking the same. I mean, that's the federal government's trying to take all these agencies, all these antiquated systems, and put them all together like the Borg collective, where resistance is futile. So I call this the rise of the machines, which is actually a reference to the Terminator series. I can't say I'm a big Terminator fan, but I thought it was appropriate because the whole plot of the Terminator movies is somebody coming from the future, going to the past to save the present type of thing. And the Data Act, to me, it's almost like a few years from now when this thing really hits for grant recipients, you're going to remember, hey, I was back a couple years ago at BBCon and somebody talked about the Data Act and how this was going to be a big deal. So let's look at exactly how they're approaching it. So they have 6 data categories. Now 5 of these categories came about during FATA. So things that you would think, like who's getting the money? Okay, that makes sense. What kind of identifier do they have? For example, a DUNS number. How much money did they get? What are the characteristics of that award? Who did it come from? What was it supposed to help? Those types of things. The funding entity, so what agency is giving the money, those types of things, the CAFTA number. The awarding entity. The funding entity, interestingly enough, and the awarding entity are not always the same. So sometimes there's one that's the agent, maybe the agency, and then there's a smaller entity under that. But the Data Act brought in account level information. So that's the piece that's been different, that probably a lot of grant recipients have not encountered before. So there's some new data that has to be brought in by the federal government. And when they're talking about these things, you may say, okay, that's really good, but where are they going to get that from? Well, they're going to get it from you eventually. And right now, they've managed to come up with what they call the table of 57 data elements. I know this is really small. Did any of you ever take those science classes where you had the periodic table on the wall? This is kind of like that. So why 57? I don't know. It's like trying to get everybody at BBCon to agree what color we're going to paint the wall. They managed through the whole government to come up with 57. But couldn't this easily be 157? One of the things that happens anytime you start collecting data is it's really easy to ask for more elements, Sometimes it's really hard to comply. For those of you who worked in the stimulus days, one of the things we had to do is suddenly start reporting the DUNS number of our 10 major vendors. And oftentimes the vendors, they'd never had a DUNS number. They didn't even know what that was. They had to send them out to something called CCR to get one. Same with executive compensation. We never captured that before. And what you'll find is they have data elements. You might not be capturing those presently, or they may be on a completely offline system. So these are the types of things you should be thinking about. Again, this is really, I know this is really small, but you can go out on this websites, and that tells you what all the definitions are and what aspects of those data elements you need to capture. It's so easy to add, it's so expensive and difficult to comply sometimes. This is kind of like, when you go to one of those 12-step programs where you say, my name is Lucy, and I'm actually a domain junkie. And you say, hi, Lucy, because you're going to help me. And so I love to get domain names. It's almost like an addiction, because I think, ooh, that's a cool one. I might use that someday. And so I go out to GoDaddy, and I get another domain. And I forget about all the work that it's going to take to actually make that domain mean something. You have to have a website, you have to think about marketing, all these things. Collecting data elements is like that, right? It's so easy to say, oh, you know what? We'd really like to know this. Let's put that on the list. So as you think about software, think about, okay, I might be fine. I don't have to worry. We get all these things already. If this list starts transforming itself into 157 elements, do you have a system? And a system doesn't necessarily mean software, but I think in this case it probably does. Do you have a database where you can easily add elements and you know where those things live and you have a place for them to be collected? Nobody wants to be filing reports under that whole scramble when you don't have half of the stuff you need. I think most of us can relate to having a deadline to file a report and you're still waiting for information from somebody. Yeah, that's what's going to happen as these lists expand if we don't have a way to capture the data and get it back turned around very quickly. So let's look at some of the setbacks and lessons learned from what the federal government's gone through. Now, for those of you who've heard me speak before, one of the things that I've talked about a lot is the importance of leadership and setting the vision for the organization. Is Tim, we only have one guy here, so your name's not Tim, right? Yeah, good, because I'm going to pick on Tim a little bit. So Tim is the Chief Financial Officer and Associate Administrator for Performance Management. This is one of the people leading the pilot of implementing the Data Act. And he said, I said in the very beginning I thought it was a boondoggle. I thought it was a compliance exercise and we were being sold a bill of goods, and yet we had no choice but to do it. That's what I believed. That's the person who's leading the charge to put this pilot in place. How many of you want to implement software or a huge transformation of your organization with someone who doesn't even believe in what you're doing? Well, this may be surprising to you, but they ran into some problems. Who would have thought with such great leadership? So the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, reported, for example, on the HHS pilot, so there was a couple of main pilots running. They were 4 months behind schedule. They were not following leading business practices in how they constructed the pilot. So they were putting together this pilot with a format that they didn't think would transfer into the actual larger implementation. And it was poorly designed and not likely to produce any scalable results. So we're running this pilot, but we don't really see a path forward to how it will transition to be run for everybody, which, if you remember back to that slide, is coming up in the spring of this year, next year. 2018 in May, the whole federal government's supposed to be reporting stuff into this new database. And likewise, the Office of Inspector General, they ran readiness reports on all the different agencies. And for example, at HUD, they said that under HUD, they had 2 agencies that they hadn't even identified that had to be compliant until the spring of 2016. Which again, that always strikes me as a little funny, because if you as an agency have to be compliant, why would you think some parts of you don't have to be? I mean, wouldn't you think it would be for everybody? And they blame the existing systems. Oh, those old legacy systems, they're a problem. Or we don't have enough resources. Kind of the same things you always hear. Department of Interior said, oh, those vendors, those darn vendors, were 6 months behind our time frames. Then you go to the DOD and EPA, and they said, we're just not going to do it. We're not going to make the deadlines. So there's a lot of blame going around. Did anybody hear me talk about silos at the talk yesterday? When you start to see a lot of blame game going on, that's part of what tells me you have a lot of siloed behavior. And who better to be siloed than a bunch of agencies at the federal government? So there's just this blame game going on, and really this is pretty normal. If you've ever done a major software implementation, you've probably heard some of these types of things. And these were 4 common issues that surfaced. One was competing priorities. Can any of you relate? I've got my work to do, and now you want me to do this other thing too. I've got my job I have to do, and now I have to go to BBCon and eat really good food and have fun and eat cake for lunch for 4 days or 3 days. So we all have competing priorities. We have a lack of resources. I don't have enough people to do this. I don't have enough people to implement this. This is a common thing to any type of system implementation. We have integration issues. In other words, this system's not talking to that system. HR is trying to recruit people, and their system is not talking to this system, and finance has got a completely different system for payroll that's not talking to the accounting system. These are common types of implementation issues. And then we have missing or conflicting guidance. In other words, nobody's telling me what to do. I would do it, but it doesn't make any sense to me. The reason that I put this slide up there is I think what you're going to find, whether you're implementing parts of the Data Act or you're implementing new software or whatever your organization is doing, you're going to hear these things. So don't let it be a surprise to you. Let's get out in front of it and already start planning for it. You know everybody's going to say the same stuff. What are we going to do about it before we even roll it out? So what's our plan? I think Tony Boers talked about standardize. What was it? Standardize. Anybody want to help me here? I have it actually written down. On how you do transformation. To me, what I do is I expect it and I normalize it. So normalize is always a big thing anytime I'm doing an implementation, because I don't want to be surprised by what really is normal behavior. So for those of you who heard me talk yesterday, believe it or not, I'm actually very much of an introvert, and the whole idea of public speaking was terrifying to me. But I just learned to normalize that that's how I would feel about it. And I really enjoy it, but I just know, a couple days before, part of my normal thing is we'll have these issues. I'll be nervous about speaking. So just like that with data implementation is you want to think about, okay, these are normal behaviors. People are going to say, hey, I've got too much work to do. What can we do to get around that? Things like that. So the Office of Management and Budget came up with a roadmap for implementation of the Data Act. And they said, here's what we recommend. And I think it's a good roadmap, not just for the federal government, but also for us whenever we do implementations. Is first of all, who's going to be on the team? Is it realistic to think that everybody's going to do all their regular work and then also do all this work to implement this? They wanted to review the data list and definitions. So this is a communication tool. Hey, we got those 57 elements up there. We probably have 57 different interpretations of what each of those elements mean. So let's get everybody on the same page, speaking the same language right from the start. Let's inventory where the data exists. Similarly, if you have to report things for your funder, where do you find that information? Who has it? Anything you can do to reduce the friction between where that information lives in source data and where it has to go, it's going to increase the speed, right? So we're not going to take the scenic route where it goes through 15 people. It's over here, it needs to be there. What's the most direct path for that to happen? Strategize and design ways to capture the required data. So the first thing you have to do is identify where all this data lives and then figure out, okay, what are the roadblocks to that getting into our system? And it's not just the Data Act. I mean, these are really kind of universal concepts. What the federal government did is they implemented what they call a broker strategy. Now, I don't know why, but broker always makes me think of the fish broker. I guess because I'm in Maryland. I don't know. It's like, you know, I watched that, what's the fishing show with the big tunas? There's like this show on the Discovery Channel where they always take the fish in and get it weighed and things. But what that is a broker strategy is really just a fancy name for a database. In other words, what they said is, hey, we recognize stuff's all over the place. Let's have one central place to put it together, and we're going to call that a broker. So all these different agencies that have stuff all over, they're going to bring it together in their broker, and then they want you to test. What they did is they tested the data in there. So is the data in there of quality or not? So are we just bringing in a bunch of garbage to just spread that out onto usaspending.gov? Or is it actually good data? So we're going to test that data. And then we might realize that, hey, the stuff that's all coming from this one area is all a bunch of garbage. We need to fix that. So that's where they did the updating the systems. And then finally, after you know that what you're going to submit is good, then you send that back out. So here we have Tim, my buddy Tim. I'm really glad he's not in the room today. So his next great quote was, Congress forced agencies to go down this route. It's been painful and there's a long way to go. Has the blame game stopped? No, it has not stopped yet. And as you can imagine, if you're working under these conditions, it makes you feel like, why am I doing this? So if you're a grant recipient and you've watched some of that, you're thinking, okay, well, maybe they'll just give up. Maybe they'll just say, you know what, it's not worth it. I don't think that is a good, likely outcome. To me, this is more like the advance of the glaciers, you know, from Ice Age, right? The glaciers are going to move. It may be slowly, but it's going to move. And you as a grant recipient want to be thinking about how are we, as they start asking for these pieces of data, what's our process to be able to accommodate them in a way that's not creating a whole bunch more burden on us as grant recipients to collect it all. So they came out and they said, okay, here's the deal. In theory, the Data Act does not change the content of your reports. It doesn't change who produces the reports. And it doesn't change who receives the reports. So they're kind of patting you on the head as a grant recipient and saying, don't worry, grant recipient. We're not changing anything. It's all going to be the same. It's still the same stuff we've always asked for. But here's the deal. What's changed is how we think about data. So it's not just data that gets put onto a report and gets put in a drawer somewhere. It's now data that has a broader impact because it's now accessible. It's accessible to anybody who wants to go out and search it. It hopefully is reliable data, and it is data that has power because it's data that is available to anybody. All they have to do is go out online and start drilling down and find out where all that money is going. And again, it's just data. Data it's like money, can be good or bad, depending on how it's used. So as you think about, we get grant funds and we spend the money, how are we going to feel about it when people start actually looking at how our money's being spent and what it's being spent on? One of the stories that I like to use is, you remember the shrimp on the treadmill. So that was a story that came out in the news. That was an NSF grant. And it was they were studying something, but they took videos of shrimp running on little tiny treadmills. And it made all the rounds of social media, and of course got a lot of flack of, oh my gosh, I can't believe they're spending money on having shrimp run on little treadmills. And actually I had someone in one of my classes one time who, they weren't directly involved in that, but they knew the researchers. And there was a perfectly legitimate reason to have shrimp run on little treadmills, but again, it gets lost in the translation. So you have to think of perception often is reality. We have to think about what is that going to look like to someone who might not understand the backstory, and as we all think in little Twitter bits, you don't have time to tell the backstory. Because there's a lot of benefits. The Data Act brings benefits to grant recipients, and it brings benefits to taxpayers. Hopefully we're going to make better decisions. We're also going to have better outcomes because it is very transparent whether or not you're spending money and getting the outcome. So for example, I was reading the paper here about a week ago, and I was reading about a grant that was given to help veterans with affordable housing. I think that's something we all can get behind. It was a grant that was done with a lot of private donations. It had federal spending. There were other foundations that chipped in. So a lot of different sources brought this funding together. They were taking shipping containers and stacking them up and doing some kind of a rehab, and it was kind of this cute little apartment type thing built inside a shipping container, two-story shipping container apartment building. The shipping container was like 900 square feet. So again, it's better than being homeless. It's something we can all get behind. By the time they tallied it all up, the cost per apartment, which nobody had done the math on, I guess, because there it was right on the, in the newspaper saying how wonderful it was we were doing this, was $446,000 per apartment. Nobody stopped to do the math. Say, okay, we're going to spend this much and we're going to help 100 people. Well, wait a minute, that's $446,000 to live in a shipping container. Does that really make sense? Couldn't we buy them a really nice $200,000 house somewhere and give them $226,000 to move across the country to where the house is only $200,000? I mean, it was in California, and I understand California is more expensive. But those types of things are possible because the numbers are getting out there and people will think about, okay, did we really get the outcome that we wanted? There's also the possibility for more transparency and accountability. So when the federal government says, well, we don't have any money to support this, you can go, but wait a minute, we spent all this money on this stuff. We as voters, we as taxpayers, we want different spending priorities. So it becomes more transparent for us as taxpayers. And then it also protects us as taxpayers because waste and fraud will be easier to detect through data analytics. So who knows if we'll get to that point where we come out of spending some money on our grant and we get a call from our agency saying, did you really just spend $100,000 on a treadmill for a shrimp? Just like it happened to me in Shopko. I mean, that's one of the goals, is we want to have the information out faster so that we can actually impact results and not just talk about what happened and we won't do it that way again. So dates to remember, May 9th, 2018, that's when the federal agencies have to start reporting all of their spending on usaspending.gov. I've got it on my calendar so I can go and see what they've been doing. And then in August of 2018, the OMB has to decide. They say if or when. To me, it's a given that it's going to be when, not if. But if you start to see the date slide for the federal agencies in May, I think you'll also see the implementation for the grant recipients to slide as well. That's my prediction. Some of the things that you want to be starting to think about is if we have to report on subrecipients, where are we going to get that data from? Because they're not on our system. So what mechanism do we have to start collecting some of those pieces of data? And if there's something specific to our agency, some little thing that our agency makes us report on that none of the other agencies do, where are we collecting that? Is that all offline somewhere, or is that something we can incorporate onto whatever database we're tracking all of our spending on? So I put together kind of the same OMB 8-step process for you as a grant recipient. As this starts to roll out, you want to have a team that's starting to talk about where are we going to get this information. You want to make sure that everybody's speaking the same language. Do we all understand what those data elements are and where they live? Where are they now? Where could they be? Do we have some way to collect the data? And it may not be a broker strategy. You might be able to put all of it on your existing software. But where do we collect all these informations? Do we have a system that's flexible enough if that list goes from 57 elements up to 157 that we can add elements? Anytime you have to have someone sitting and entering things into that data storage place, you've increased friction and slowed down the rate. If you heard my story about daughters yesterday, I mean, nobody wants the job of the future where you're sitting and entering data. You want that stuff to move seamlessly through your system. And then you want to make sure that you're getting good information. So you want to test how that works. You might have to do some tweaks on it, and finally so that you're reporting good information back up to the federal government so that then they can in turn report that information into usaspending.gov. Learn from experience. And even Tim got on board. He finally said, it is definitely not a boondoggle in my opinion. And I know all the people working for Tim probably just went, hooray! We're so glad to be working for Tim. Make sure leadership is on board. I mean, what you're doing there is really leading from behind. What's in there now is more the pilot information, and then they're starting to collect some of the elements, but not all the new elements. So you can go out onto the beta site and you can do a lot, but you're going to find some of the things you might want to search on. Those fields have not been populated yet. So just going to the regular usaspending.gov, I can already go out and see, okay, who's getting money in my neighborhood, but I can't trace it back to the appropriation. That's the piece of it that's missing. What's happened with the original usaspending.gov is everybody just reported stuff, but there was never any way to like track it all the way back. So that's what's coming in, is you can actually, when a piece of legislation is passed, you'll be able to track it all the way through to who got the money and how was it spent. So it'll be pretty cool. And again, if I'm looking for money, I'm always out on usaspending.gov because I want to know the language that's used of people who've successfully gotten money. So will the Data Act live up to the promise? I would say yes. But I don't think it'll happen fast. But I think it's going to be really neat. I'm really looking forward to the day that it's not just a group of 80-year-old ladies in Arizona who are talking to me about trail spending, but everybody's using that tool not only to get more money, but also to hold our leaders accountable on how that money's being spent. So I think it really is going to be a huge transformational type of thing. And the truth is that the money is going to flow to people who are prepared. One of my goals in this whole conference is to help you be more attractive to funders. If you're starting to be prepared for this, you're going to be their favorite. You know, they're going to be like BFFs because you already understand what they've been going through. For those of you who are interested, I'm going to be holding a webinar with Blackbaud on November 16th, so we'll be talking about the Data Act again. If you have someone that in your organization that might be interested in this, like IT folks who don't always come to these conferences. And of course, you can contact me. I'm very active on LinkedIn. If anybody's on LinkedIn, there all the time. Twitter. You have my email if you have questions. Be happy to answer your questions. And make sure to use that BBCon hashtag when you go and tweet. And finally, I have one favor to ask. It's very helpful to me to get feedback on what you think of the sessions. And I have a great bribe on, oh, I can't say bribe because we're talking about grants. Got some free stuff. If you put in the session survey, you get registered for a chance to go to BBCon in Orlando, my new home state, in 2018. So it's going to be October 9th through 11th in Orlando, and someone's going to win a free pass to that. So I'm going to be around for a while if you have any questions. I hope the rest of your day is great. Thank you for showing up at 9 o'clock in the morning to talk about the Data Act, and I look forward to running into some of you at other sessions here today.